The rain fell gently over the ancient stones of York's streets, tracing silver paths along the cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Amelia appeared running through the narrow alley between two rows of terraced houses, their brick facades darkened by moisture and age. Her shoes were completely soaked, water squelching with every desperate stride. Tears streamed down her cheeks, mixing with the rain. Her face a portrait of raw terror and determination. Her small hands gripped the hem of her muddied skirt, lifting it just enough to prevent herself from tripping as she ran. Her pleading gaze remained fixed on one destination, the imposing grey door of a mansion that stood apart from the modest dwellings surrounding it, a monument to wealth and power in a neighbourhood forgotten by fortune. The mansion belonged to the Duke of Rutherford, and everyone in York knew his name. Some spoke it with respect, others with fear, and many with both. He was a controversial figure, immensely wealthy, politically influential, and surrounded by an aura that unsettled even the boldest residents of the town. Rumours swirled about his past, whispers of ruthless business dealings, of enemies who had crossed him and disappeared from public life, of a man who valued control above all else. Yet there were also quieter stories, ones told in hushed tones in the pubs along the River Ouse, about acts of unexpected generosity, about workers whose families he had saved from destitution, about justice delivered when the law had failed. The Duke was an enigma, and most people preferred to admire or fear him from a safe distance. Amelia had no such luxury. She barely paused to catch her breath before she reached up and rang the bell with trembling fingers. The sound echoed through the entrance hall beyond, a deep, resonant chime that seemed to reverberate through her very bones. She waited, heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. The door opened, and a butler appeared, his expression shifting from polite inquiry to visible displeasure as he took in the sight of the rain-soaked, tear-stained girl on the doorstep. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his tone clipped and disapproving. "This is not a place for—" "Please," Amelia interrupted, her voice breaking. "I need to speak to the Duke. It's urgent. It's life or death." The butler's frown deepened, but something in the girl's desperation must have reached him, because after a moment's hesitation he stepped aside. "Wait here," he instructed coldly, gesturing to a spot just inside the entrance hall. "Do not move from that position, and do not touch anything." Amelia nodded frantically, barely hearing his words. She stood where he indicated, dripping water onto the polished marble floor, her eyes darting around the grand entrance. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their light glinting off gilt-framed paintings of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to judge her from their positions on the walls. A grandfather clock ticked loudly in the corner, marking each second of her agonizing wait. Inside his private study, the Duke of Rutherford had been enjoying a rare moment of peace. He sat in a leather armchair by the fireplace, a book of political philosophy open on his lap, a cup of Earl Grey tea steaming gently on the side table. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across the room's dark wood panelling. He was a man of considerable presence even in repose, tall, with broad shoulders, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, his features strong and aristocratic. He wore a perfectly tailored jacket of midnight blue, a crisp white shirt, and a silk cravat. Everything about him spoke of control, precision, and power. The butler's knock interrupted his reading. "Your Grace, I apologize for the disturbance, but there is a situation. A young girl has arrived at the door, quite distressed. She insists she must speak with you urgently." The Duke's eyebrows rose slightly. "A girl? What girl?" "I do not recognize her, Your Grace. She appears to be from one of the poorer districts. She is soaking wet and quite emotional." For a moment, the Duke considered simply having the butler send her away. He had important correspondence to attend to, meetings scheduled for the following day, a dozen matters that required his attention. But something, perhaps simple curiosity, perhaps a memory of his own past desperation, made him set down his book and rise to his feet. "Bring her to me," he said. Moments later, Amelia was ushered into the study. She stood just inside the doorway, a small, bedraggled figure against the room's grandeur, water still dripping from her clothes onto the expensive Persian rug. The Duke observed her with an expression that revealed nothing, his grey eyes taking in every detail, the mud on her skirt, the way her hands trembled, the desperate hope mixed with terror in her young face. He gestured to a chair near the fire. "Sit, you're shivering." Amelia shook her head violently. "There's no time, sir. Please, you have to help me. They're beating my mother. Right now, they won't stop. I don't know what else to do. Everyone says you're the most powerful man in York. Everyone fears you. Please, sir, please." The words tumbled out in a rush, barely coherent, her voice rising to almost a wail at the end. The Duke remained perfectly still for a long moment, his expression unchanged. Then, without apparent hurry, he reached for his teacup and took a final sip, setting it down with deliberate precision before speaking. "Why have you come to me?" His voice was deep and controlled, carrying the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "York has police. There are proper channels for such matters. The police won't come fast enough," Amelia cried. "And they don't care about people like us. We've called before. They take hours, if they come at all. But everyone says that when you act, things change, that people listen to you, that you can make people stop." She took a shuddering breath. "They say everyone fears you, sir, and only someone truly feared can stop them." The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the rain-swept grounds of his estate. Behind his carefully controlled exterior, memories stirred, memories of another time, another desperate plea he had been too late to answer. He had built his reputation on strength and fear, yes, but he had never forgotten the cost of powerlessness. He turned back to face Amelia. "What is your name, child?" "To Amelia Bramall, sir. Bramall." The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew the name, a family of modest means, shopkeepers or tradespeople, if he remembered correctly. Decent people fallen on hard times. "And who is beating your mother?" "Her brother, my uncle." Amelia's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He drinks, sir, and when he drinks he gets violent. He's been living with us for months, and my mother can't make him leave. Today he started drinking early, and when she asked him for the rent money he owes us, Her voice broke. "I heard her screaming. I saw him hit her, and I ran. I ran here because I didn't know where else to go." The Duke observed the girl carefully. There was something achingly genuine in her desperation, something that reminded him painfully of his own past, moments when wealth and power had failed to protect the people he loved most. His younger sister's face flashed through his memory, a ghost he had carried for 20 years. He made his decision in that instant. Striding to his desk, he pressed a button that summoned his personal secretary. When the man appeared, the Duke's orders were crisp and clear. "Send for Thomas and Henry immediately. Have them bring the carriage around. Tell them to be prepared for a potentially volatile situation, and send word to Inspector Morrison that I may require police presence at an address I will provide." The secretary nodded and departed swiftly. The Duke turned back to Amelia, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Where exactly do you live?" "Millgate Street, sir. Number 42, near the canal." The Duke nodded. He knew the area, a row of cramped terraced houses in one of York's poorest districts, where generations of working families struggled to survive in conditions that would have been considered unacceptable a century ago, yet somehow persisted. It was a 20-minute drive from his residence. "Come," he said, reaching for his overcoat and his walking stick, an elegant piece of carved oak with a silver handle. "We leave immediately." Amelia's eyes widened with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "You'll really help?" The Duke paused at the doorway, glancing back at her. For just a moment his carefully maintained mask slipped, and she saw something raw in his expression, old pain, determination, and perhaps a need for redemption. "I will," he said simply. "Now come. Every moment we delay could matter." They descended the grand staircase together, an unlikely pair, the most powerful man in York and a desperate girl from the poorest quarter of the city. The butler helped the Duke into his overcoat. While casting disapproving glances at the water, Amelia continued to trail across the floor. Outside, two men waited by a sleek black carriage, both powerfully built and watchful. These were Thomas and Henry, the Duke's personal bodyguards and most trusted employees. "Your Grace," Thomas acknowledged with a respectful nod. "We're going to Millgate Street," the Duke informed them. "Number 42. There may be an altercation in progress. Be prepared, but use restraint unless absolutely necessary. I want this resolved without unnecessary violence, if possible." Both men nodded their understanding. They had served the Duke long enough to trust his judgment in such matters, even when those matters took them to unexpected places. The Duke helped Amelia into the carriage, then climbed in beside her. As they pulled away from the mansion and into the rain-soaked streets of York, an uncomfortable silence filled the space between them. Amelia sat rigidly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, hardly daring to believe this was really happening. The Duke gazed out the window, watching the elegant streets of his own neighborhood give way gradually to more modest areas. Shops with faded signs, houses with peeling paint, people hurrying through the rain with heads down and shoulders hunched. After several minutes, he spoke without turning from the window. "Do you understand the risk of challenging violent men, child? Even with my presence, there are no guarantees of how this will unfold. Your uncle may be beyond reason." Amelia's reply came immediately, her voice steady despite her fear. "My mother is all I have, sir. If something happens to her—" She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "I'd rather die trying to save her than live knowing I did nothing." The Duke finally turned to look at her, and for the first time, something like approval flickered in his eyes. Courage, he had learned, was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. This girl possessed that rare quality. "Let us hope it does not come to that," he said quietly. The carriage rolled on through the rain, each turn bringing them closer to Millgate Street, closer to whatever awaited them there. The Duke's hand rested on the silver handle of his walking stick, his expression calm, but his mind calculating possibilities, preparing for confrontation. Beside him, Amelia pressed her face to the window, willing the horses to move faster, praying they would not be too late. As they crossed the bridge over the River Ouse, the character of the neighborhood changed markedly. The houses grew smaller, more cramped together. Laundry hung limply from lines strung between buildings despite the rain. Children played in puddles with no apparent supervision. Adults lingered in doorways, watching the expensive carriage pass, with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion to resentment. The carriage slowed as it navigated the narrow streets, finally coming to a stop outside number 42 Millgate Street. Even before the Duke descended, he could hear shouting from within the house, a man's voice, slurred and belligerent, and beneath it, a woman's pleading cries. Thomas and Henry were already moving, positioning themselves near the door. The Duke stepped down from the carriage, his presence immediately drawing attention from neighbors who had begun to gather. An expensive carriage in Millgate Street was unusual enough. The Duke of Rutherford himself appearing on their doorstep was unprecedented. Amelia rushed to the door, but the Duke's hand on her shoulder stopped her. "Stay behind me," he instructed firmly. "I will handle this." He approached the door with measured steps, each one deliberate and controlled. The sounds from within were growing more violent. Crashes, breaking furniture, a woman's scream. Without knocking, the Duke tried the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, Thomas and Henry flanking him, Amelia hovering anxiously behind them all. The scene that greeted them would remain burned in the Duke's memory. The tiny front room was in chaos. Overturned furniture, broken glass scattered across the floor, and in the center of it all, a man stood over a woman who had collapsed against the wall, her face bloodied, her arms raised defensively. The man, Amelia's uncle, was perhaps 40 years old, unshaven, his clothes disheveled, a nearly empty bottle still clutched in one hand. He had his other hand raised, about to strike again. "Stop!" The Duke's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, a single word carrying such authority that the man actually froze mid-motion. Every eye in the room turned to the doorway where the Duke stood, framed by the grey daylight behind him, his expression colder than the rain outside. The uncle's face went through several rapid transformations: confusion, recognition, then fear. Even in his drunken state, he knew who stood before him. Everyone in York knew the Duke of Rutherford. "Who the hell are you to—" The man began, attempting bravado, but his voice wavered. "Someone you do not want to test," the Duke interrupted. "Step away from her, now." The tension in the cramped room was palpable, the air thick with the stench of alcohol and violence. The Duke stood perfectly still in the doorway, his grey eyes fixed on Amelia's uncle with an intensity that seemed to pin the man in place. Behind the Duke, Thomas and Henry had positioned themselves strategically, their mere presence a silent threat. Amelia pressed herself against the wall, her eyes darting between her mother's crumpled form and the confrontation unfolding before her. For a long moment, nobody moved. The uncle swayed slightly, bottle still in hand, his face flushed with drink and rage. But even through the fog of alcohol, some primitive survival instinct must have registered the danger he now faced. The Duke was not physically threatening him. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved aggressively, but something in his bearing, in the absolute certainty of his authority, made resistance seem futile. "This is my family," the uncle finally muttered, though with far less conviction than his initial outburst. "You've got no right to—" "I have every right," the Duke interrupted quietly, taking a single step into the room. "The moment you raised your hand against a defenseless woman, you forfeited any claim to family protection. Now, I will not repeat myself. Step away from her." The uncle's eyes darted around the room, perhaps seeking escape, perhaps weighing his chances. But Thomas and Henry had already moved to block the other exit, and even in his impaired state, he could calculate those odds. With a curse, he stumbled backwards, nearly tripping over an overturned chair. The Duke immediately moved to Amelia's mother, kneeling beside her with surprising grace for a man of his stature. Up close, the damage was even worse than it had appeared from the doorway. Her face was swollen and bloodied, her lips split, one eye already beginning to blacken. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and she held one arm at an odd angle that suggested possible injury. "Mrs. Bramall," the Duke said gently, his voice transformed from the cold command he had used on the uncle to something approaching kindness. "I am the Duke of Rutherford. Your daughter came to me for help. Can you stand?" The woman looked up at him with dazed incomprehension, as though unable to process why one of the most powerful men in England was kneeling on her dirty floor. She opened her mouth, but only a pained whimper emerged. "Amelia!" the Duke called over his shoulder. "Fetch me something clean. A towel, a cloth, anything." Amelia rushed to obey, returning moments later with a threadbare but clean kitchen towel. The Duke took it and gently began to clean the blood from Mrs. Bramall's face, his movements surprisingly delicate. As he worked, he spoke in a low, reassuring tone. "You're safe now. We're going to get you medical attention. But first, I need to know, Are you seriously injured? Can you feel your limbs? Mrs. Bramall nodded weakly. I think so. My arm hurts. And my ribs. Don't try to move too quickly, the Duke advised. He glanced at Thomas. Send for Dr. Harrison. Tell him I need him at this address immediately, and then contact Inspector Morrison. No! Mrs. Bramall's sudden cry startled everyone. Her good hand shot out and gripped the Duke's arm with surprising strength. Please, no police. He's family. He's my brother. If they arrest him, it'll destroy what's left of our family name. People will talk. We'll be marked. The Duke's expression hardened. Mrs. Bramall, your brother has committed assault. Possibly aggravated assault. The law doesn't care about people like us, she interrupted, her voice rising to near hysteria. You don't understand. If this gets out, if he goes to jail, we'll lose everything. Nobody will hire me. Nobody will rent to us. We'll be the family with the criminal brother, the family with the domestic violence scandal. Please, Your Grace, please just make him leave. Make him go away and never come back. But don't involve the police. The Duke sat back on his heels, frustration evident in the tightness around his eyes. He understood her fear. The social stigma of scandal could indeed destroy a working-class family's reputation and prospects in ways the aristocracy rarely experienced. But every instinct he possessed rebelled against allowing a violent man to simply walk away. He became aware that Amelia had moved to her mother's other side, had taken her hand, and was holding it tightly. The girl was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she looked at her mother's injuries. The sight of their connection, their obvious devotion to each other, despite their circumstances, touched something in the Duke that he had thought long buried. His sister's face flashed through his memory again, unbidden. Elizabeth, sweet, laughing Elizabeth, who had died 20 years ago because he had been too young, too powerless to protect her from their father's rage. The old Duke had been a monster behind closed doors, a man who presented charm and sophistication to society while brutalizing his family in private. And when Elizabeth had finally worked up the courage to report him, to seek help, the authorities had looked the other way, because he was powerful, because he was nobility, because domestic matters were not their concern. The Duke had been only 17 when Elizabeth died from injuries sustained in a beating their father delivered after learning of her betrayal. The official story had been a riding accident. The truth had been buried with her. And the young man who would become the current Duke had sworn that day, standing over his sister's grave, that he would never be powerless again, and that he would never ignore a cry for help. He rose to his feet and turned to face Amelia's uncle, who had retreated to the far corner of the room and was watching proceedings with sullen wariness. The Duke crossed the small space in 3 long strides, and though he was careful not to touch the man, his proximity and bearing were more intimidating than any physical threat. "Here is what will happen," the Duke said, his voice low and cold. "You will leave this house immediately. You will not return, ever, not for your possessions, not to apologize, not for any reason whatsoever. If you so much as walk down this street again, if you attempt any contact with Mrs. Bramall or her daughter, if you so much as speak their names in public, I will know, and I will ensure that you face consequences that make jail seem pleasant by comparison. Do you understand?" The uncle's eyes widened. "You can't just—" "Yes, I can," the Duke interrupted. "You have no idea what I can do. I could have you blacklisted from every employer in Yorkshire. I could ensure that no pub will serve you, no landlord will rent to you, that you become invisible in this city. Or," he paused meaningfully, "I could simply stop protecting you, and let it be known in certain circles that you are a man who beats women. There are establishments in York where men with such reputations find themselves in very unfortunate accidents. Dark alleys, late nights, so many things can go wrong. The threat hung in the air, and though the Duke would never actually follow through on such illegal action, the uncle didn't know that. What he saw was a man with virtually unlimited resources and influence. A man who had walked into his life like an avenging angel and could destroy him with a few words in the right ears. "I understand," he muttered finally. "Say it clearly. I understand. I'll leave. I'll never come back." "Good." The Duke stepped back. "Thomas, escort this gentleman from the premises. Make sure he understands the permanence of this arrangement." Thomas moved forward, and despite being several inches shorter than the uncle, his professional demeanor and evident capability made the choice clear. The uncle cast one last look at his sister. Whether regret, resentment, or simple confusion flickered across his face was impossible to tell, then allowed himself to be guided out the door and into the rainy street beyond. The Duke turned his attention back to Mrs. Bramall and Amelia. The woman was still on the floor, leaning heavily against the wall, her daughter clutched protectively to her side. Now that the immediate danger had passed, shock was beginning to set in. Mrs. Bramall was shaking, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Henry!" the Duke called to his remaining bodyguard. "Help me get her to the sofa. Carefully, her ribs may be cracked." Together, they lifted Mrs. Bramall as gently as possible and settled her onto the threadbare sofa, propping pillows behind her back. Amelia hovered anxiously, holding her mother's hand. The Duke noticed how the girl seemed to be cataloguing every injury, her young face creased with worry and guilt, as though any of this could possibly be her fault. "Amelia," the Duke said softly, "the doctor will be here soon. In the meantime, could you make some tea? Something hot and sweet would help with the shock." The girl hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave her mother's side, but eventually nodded and disappeared into what must have been the kitchen. The Duke heard the sound of a kettle being filled, the clatter of cups. He settled into the single armchair opposite the sofa, acutely aware of how out of place he looked in this modest setting. His expensive coat, his polished shoes, the whole bearing of wealth and privilege among such poverty. Mrs. Bramall watched him with an expression of continued incomprehension, as though the past 15 minutes had been some kind of fever dream. "Why?" she finally whispered. "Why would you help us? You don't know us. We're nobody." The Duke was silent for a moment, considering his answer. He could offer the simple truth that her daughter had asked for help, and he had provided it. But there was a deeper truth, one he rarely acknowledged even to himself. "I had a sister once," he said quietly, "younger than me, kind, gentle, everything good in our family. Our father was a difficult man, a violent man. Nobody outside our household knew, of course. We were nobility. Such things were kept private." His voice had taken on a distant quality, as though he were speaking from very far away. "Elizabeth tried to get help. She went to the authorities, to people she thought could protect her. But our father was too powerful, and she was just a girl. Nobody wanted to get involved." Mrs. Bramall's eyes widened with dawning understanding. "What happened to her?" "She died," the Duke said simply. 20 years ago, our father beat her to death, and the official story was a riding accident. I was 17. I couldn't stop him. I couldn't save her." He met Mrs. Bramall's gaze directly. "I swore that day that if I ever had the power to help someone in Elizabeth's situation, I would. Your daughter gave me that opportunity. So you see, Mrs. Bramall, you're not nobody. You're somebody who needed help, and somebody who had the courage to let a child seek it. That matters." Before Mrs. Bramall could respond, Amelia returned with a tray bearing 3 mismatched cups of tea. Her hands shook slightly as she distributed them, but her voice was steadier when she spoke. The kettle was already hot. Mum always keeps it ready. "Your mother is a wise woman," the Duke said, accepting his cup. The tea was strong and very sweet, probably far too sweet for his usual taste, but he drank it without complaint. They sat in awkward silence for several minutes, the only sounds the ticking of a cheap clock on the mantel and the rain continuing outside. The Duke used the time to observe the house more carefully. It was clean despite its poverty. No dirt, no disorder except what the recent violence had created. There were signs of care. A vase of wilted but once cheerful flowers on the windowsill, lace curtains that had been mended multiple times but were still hung with pride, books on a small shelf, suggesting education and aspiration. These were good people, he realized. People who were trying their best in impossible circumstances, people who deserved better than the hand life had dealt them. The doctor arrived 15 minutes later, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a worn medical bag. Dr. Harrison had served the Duke's household for years and asked no questions about why he'd been summoned to Millgate Street. He examined Mrs. Bramall with professional efficiency, his expressions growing more concerned as he catalogued her injuries. 2 cracked ribs, possibly 3, he reported finally. Severe bruising. The arm isn't broken, thank God, but it's badly sprained. You'll need to keep it immobilized for at least 2 weeks. The facial wounds will heal, though there may be some scarring. He turned to the Duke. She should really be in hospital. No, Mrs. Bramall said immediately. I can't afford... I will cover all medical expenses, the Duke interrupted. That is not open for discussion. However, Dr. Harrison, if Mrs. Bramall truly wishes to remain at home, can you provide the necessary care here? The doctor considered. I can. I'll need to return daily for the first week to monitor for complications. Internal injuries can take time to manifest. And she'll need pain medication, bandages, proper nutrition to aid healing. Whatever she needs, provide it. Send all bills to my estate. I'll arrange for payment immediately. Dr. Harrison nodded and began preparing bandages to wrap Mrs. Bramall's ribs. As he worked, the Duke drew Amelia aside. Your mother will recover, he said quietly, but she'll need care, rest, and time. Can you manage that? Amelia nodded, though worry clouded her features. I'll do my best, sir. But I have school, and Mum usually works at the laundry and without her wages. She trailed off, the impossible mathematics of poverty evident in her expression. The Duke made another decision. I will arrange for financial assistance, enough to cover your household expenses until your mother can work again. Consider it a loan if your pride demands it, though I expect no repayment. Additionally, I'll speak with your mother's employer about holding her position. You do that. Why? We can never repay you for everything you've already... Amelia! The Duke's voice stopped her mid-sentence. Some debts are not meant to be repaid with money. Your courage today, coming to seek help despite your fear, that matters more than you know. Now go sit with your mother. She needs you.